Good morning. Welcome, everyone, from across the globe to our first live broadcast from Bacol International. My name is Julian Fredette in Winnipeg, in Canada. I'm chair of the Bacol International Leadership Team, and with me to assist in ensuring that everything runs smoothly is Sister Wea Villanueva, RNDM from Philippines, and Elizabeth Young from Hobart in Australia. The Bacol organization is over 40 years old, having been started through the efforts of Sister Maureen Fritz, NDS, and Sister Ann Anderson, CSJ. We are ever grateful to both for the work they have done over the years. Sister Marina, for her part, is still working with Bacol and has joined us today. Today, we continue the legacy they have engendered in people throughout the world. One example of these efforts is the work carried out by the Bacol International Leadership Team, which has been in existence since 2016, along with that of a sister organization, Bacol Online. We will tell you more about both following the presentation by Rabbi Michael. Rabbi Michael, with whom we are gathered today, is a longtime friend of Bacol. He has been involved with the Bacol Institute since its early years as a teacher, on staff, and as a member of the International Board of the Bacol Institute. Anytime we have something special taking place, Rabbi Michael is one of the first friends of Bacol we seek and invite to participate. Today, we will welcome him to speak to us of his new book, Living the Letters, an alphabet of emerging Jewish thought, recently published and released as an open access book, a gesture I had never heard of. We will listen attentively as he speaks to us of his book of Jewish theology and his distinction between what he refers to as smooth theology and crunchy theology, thinking of peanut butter. Those of us who love peanut butter will understand this distinction. You will have had an opportunity to read about that and much more in the introduction of his book. And now, without going any further, please join me in welcoming Rabbi Michael Marmur. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. It is a delight to be with you. As was mentioned, anything anything that Morena is involved in, anything that Batcol is doing, I'm always keen to be part of. And my job in the next few minutes is to present to you a book that recently appeared. This is what it looks like in its physical form. It's called Living the Letters. As Julian pointed out, it is available as in an open access format. So let me tell you what that means. If you read on a Kindle or any other similar device, or if you don't mind reading the book on your computer or on your telephone or whatever else, you can get a copy of the book for free. You can do so if you through Amazon or wherever else you might download books for a Kindle. You put in my name and the name of the book, and it'll show up for the good price of $0. Or you can go to the site. The publisher is called Palgrave Macmillan, but that is a title of Springer Nature, which is a huge international publishing concern. And if you go to their website called Springer Link, and again put in my name or the name of Living the Letters, you'll be invited to download the entire book for nothing. If you're old-fashioned enough to like a book in its physical form, then you can get it the way wherever you are in the world, how you would go about ordering a book through one of those book delivery services. It's priced in its physical form. Well, in euro, it's priced at €30, and whatever the equivalent price is in whichever currency you happen to be in. So those are the kind of technical details. What I'm going to do is present to you something about the structure of the book and the intention of the book, and hopefully leave plenty of time in the next few minutes for any questions or thoughts or comments which come up. I do want to open this by saying that we need to acknowledge the context within which this conversation is taking place. And that context, from my perspective, is that we are in the midst of the deepest crisis that Israel has known in the more than 40 years that I have lived here, in a profound crisis, which is in nature political, moral, military, and security. It's to do with democracy and the rule of law. It's to do with the basic humanity of every person. It is a huge social crisis, and there's no way that such a thing should be underplayed or somehow ignored. And so while our lives continue in their usual way and books are launched and things happen, in the backdrop of all of this is a grave crisis. Where the crisis and how it began and what its solutions are and all the rest of it, that's not really the topic for our conversation today. Although, as you will see in my version of theology, of Jewish theology, political questions and urgent, immediate, pressing questions are not foreign to that world of discourse. If I am able to share the screen, I believe I am. We'll see if this works. You should be seeing in a second. It should come up in a minute. Let me see if I can start this. You're still not seeing. You should now be seeing Living the Letters and the Alphabet of Emerging Jewish Thought. Has that come through?
Yes, Michael.
Yes, good. Well, that's promising. So on the right, you see a version of the book art. My talented sister Elizabeth is responsible for the art. And as you can see, it's a tree or some kind of organic thing that is sprouting shapes that bear the similarity to some of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Don't try to read too much meaning into the illustration. It doesn't spell out a particular word, and those letters aren't altogether Hebrew letters either, many of them, but they look as if they might be. It's a kind of artistic representation of letters kind of springing out of the earth. Hopefully you've just seen, you've seen that I've changed the screen. And here it may be a bit small for you, but I will read for you. These are words from the very introduction of the book. I was in prison, I write, when I decided to write this book. I thought that was a good way to start, an unexpected way to start the work. It was the early 1990s, and I was serving as perhaps Israel's least significant soldier. That's a title I bear with pride. A military policeman stationed at Megiddo jail. The prison was then serving as a detention center for Palestinians detained in Jenin and neighboring villages and other locations on the West Bank. Location of famous battles from thousands of years ago and up until the First World War, the site, Megiddo, is also known as Armageddon. So I started writing this book in Armageddon when I was stationed doing my obligatory military service as a military policeman. In search of distraction, I had brought with me a copy of a great work of Reformed Jewish theology called Renewing the Covenant by Eugene Borowitz, a man I was privileged to know, who died a few years ago, who was really the doyen of American Reformed Jewish theologians for the latter part of the 20th century. I brought with him a copy of his book, Renewing the Covenant. I spent my free hours reading this important work on the possibilities of Jewish commitment in a non-Orthodox context, what he describes as a post-liberal theory of Jewish duty. Right? The question he's asking is, an Orthodox Jew knows very well, or at least purportedly knows very well, why they are committed and what they are committed to do every minute of every day as their lives are described through the parameters of halakha, of Jewish law. And a Jew who cares nothing for their religious tradition will not feel obliged by any of that. But what about a Jew like me, a religious liberal Jew, What kind of theology of duty impels me, drives me? What do I feel bound to do and to be in the world? My favorite location for reading was the synagogue, selected less for its air of sanctity than for its air conditioner. It was very, very hot. If you've ever been to Megiddo, you'll know how extremely hot it is in the summer. Um, Reading Borowitz's theology of Jewish duty in a military jail convinced me to write something of my own. In other words, he was asking his questions from a fundamentally diaspora context. Whereas for me, living in the first era of Jewish sovereignty in 2000 years, the questions that he was asking resonated in a quite different way for me. So this is the book I write in the introduction. I first imagined all those years ago, I first imagined writing in the synagogue in Armageddon. The book is, the structure of the book is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and maybe just to vary things, I'll take the screen away for a moment and just talk to you directly. Jewish theology is a highly contested term. So you'll find many Jews who'll tell you that theology is a Christian category and not a Jewish category. It's not something that we Jews do. But all I'll tell you is that for all of our protesting that we don't do theology, there's quite a lot of Jewish theology to be found if you know if you know how you wish to define that term and where it is you're looking. One of the big questions about theology in any tradition, thought of any kind, is not just the content, the things you're trying to say, but the particular format, the way in which you choose to say them. And I spent a lot of time as I was thinking about how I wanted my book to be, contemplating issues of structure. And what I ended up doing was writing a long introduction, I don't know, 60 pages or something, where I set out some points that I'm about to share with you. And then I adopted a very traditional, a highly traditional Jewish structure, which is the alphabet. Those of you who know well your Hebrew Bible, will be, particularly if you've ever had an opportunity to read it in Hebrew, may be aware that a number of chapters and sections of the Hebrew Bible are written using an alphabetic structure. At least 5 of the Psalms are alphabetic in nature. All of the Book of Lamentations, each chapter of the Book of Lamentations is centered around the alphabet. Even the very last chapter of that book, where it doesn't go according the first verse with an aleph, the second verse with a bet, the third verse with a gimel. But even in that book, in the last chapter of Lamentations, there are 22 verses, just as there are 22 letters of the alphabet. The last chapter of the book of Proverbs, which is the great hymn to the ideal Jewish woman, as at least the author of Proverbs imagined her, and other sections of the Hebrew Bible. And after that, through the Second Temple period, the period of rabbinic literature, and then in an extravagant manner in the Middle Ages, the poets, the liturgical poets of our tradition and others have long employed the alphabet as a rubric. And I think there's good reasons for doing so. The alphabet in our tradition represents more than just a random kind of selection of letters, a rubric that you remember when you're a child and it helps you read stuff. The letters of the Hebrew alphabet are afforded huge religious significance in our tradition. In fact, the letters themselves are the tools by which the world itself is created. Okay? And there's a great deal amongst the mystics, certainly in the mystical, the Kabbalistic tradition, but also in rationalists and throughout, you'll see a great deal of emphasis and interest on the alphabet. And if you think about it, let's think about the Western culture for a moment. The alphabet is also used when you're trying to describe a kind of totality, A, you're adorable. B, but you're beautiful. If you any of you remember that old song, and there are many such others where how can I count the ways? There's the whole alphabet. It's the alpha to the omega. It's the whole thing, the whole enchilada. It somehow speaks to a totality, whilst at the same time having a limited, manageable. One of the things that the historians of the alphabet tell us is that virtually all alphabets, not every language system has what we would describe as an alphabet, but many of them do. And one of the things that they have in common, and actually distinct here from the system of letters known in Chinese and Japanese and other such languages, is that they all have a limited number of symbols, usually 20 something or 30 something symbols. Why? Because it's easily teachable to a young child as they're beginning their process of learning literacy and so forth. It's a mnemonic device. It's big enough to imply totality, everything, but it's small enough to be manageable so that you can grapple with it. And so, how my book works is I've tried to set out my own personal agenda for what I call emerging Jewish thought. And I do so after an introduction by having 22 chapters. Each of them are short. I mean, the whole book, just to show you, this is the whole book. It's not like an encyclopedia, it's relatively short. But each of those 22 chapters relates to a concept or a theme, which is captured by a Hebrew word or a Hebrew phrase, which begins in order with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so it kind of goes through it uses the alphabet as a framework upon which I pin the various ideas I want to talk about. These are the main sections that characterize the introduction to my book. The first section is called Anxiety and Hope. And I make the claim that Jewish thought has been produced over a very long period of time, usually as the result of a combination of anxiety and hope. Anxiety we tend to think of as a condition that needs to be avoided or medicated or controlled in some way. But I make the case that anxiety, I don't know if I use the expression in the book, but you might say that anxiety is like cholesterol. There's a good kind and there's a bad kind. There is a sort of anxiety which paralyzes us, but there is also a sort of anxiety which galvanizes us. And so I give name to some of my my darkest anxieties, not only about all of the global things, the planet and sustainability and all of that, which is, of course, a very palpable anxiety, but particular Jewish anxieties. And I point to two above all. I mean, they cover a multitude of smaller anxieties. One relates to the project of modern Judaism. I am myself the result and both an exponent of and a disciple of, a result of a certain approach which suggests that you can be both fully and in an engaged way fully Jewish and yet in parallel fully modern. And I am anxious about the prospects for such a project. I ask whether our idea of a modern Judaism can work, given, I mean, if you look around the world, the enormous pressures that are put on that attempt to combine these two things together. And the second big anxiety, which is related to it, of course, relates to the state of Israel, the state where I came as a young man in my early 20s and where I built my life, and about which I have profound, abiding concerns as to where we're heading and how we can move forward in a positive direction. So there's a lot of anxiety in the book, and I make the case that books, thoughts, many significant works of Jewish thought, much more significant than mine, have been written in direct response to anxieties. I give some examples. Sadia Gaon over 1,000 years ago, Jonathan Sacks, who writes a book 4 or 5 decades ago called Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? Many of the people on this call are not Jewish, and therefore that question may not occupy them. But believe me, for Jewish people, that question, he was speaking to a real anxiety that people have. Will our attempt to be Jewish and be part of the modern world, will it work, or will this experiment fail? So I give examples from across our history of how anxiety has been an engine. Alongside this, I argue, if all you have is anxiety, you won't produce anything constructive and dynamic and interesting. There needs to be hope. And I go into, I'm not going to do this now because there isn't time. I talk about different meanings of the Jewish conception of hope. I then make a distinction, as Julian mentioned in his introduction to this, between two kinds of theology, crunchy and smooth. And that is indeed taken from years of choosing between crunchy and smooth peanut butter over breakfast. I came to the conclusion it's quite a good way of making a distinction. Let me explain to you what I mean. First of all, I go in and talk about what theology is. And if we have time, we'll maybe come back to that, and I can exemplify it. But the business about smooth and crunchy goes like this. A smooth theology attempts to give you satisfactory answers to all of the great problems. It spreads smoothly and easily, and it reaches every corner. It's many attempts at systematic theology in the Christian tradition have had the quality of smoothness about them. Crunchy theology is a bit different. It doesn't attempt to it goes down less easy, that it gets, there are lots of bits and chunks in it, but it tries to grapple in a less harmonious kind of a way with many of the big abiding questions that we face. And I position this book very much in the crunchy category as opposed to the smooth. If there's time and if you're interested, we can talk more about that distinction. I then talk about alphabets in Jewish culture. I've said something about that in the last few minutes. I talk about a fascinating concept that comes to expression in the 19th century with the work of Moses Mendelssohn, one of the greatest figures in the birth of Jewish modernity, who talks about alphabets and scripts and suggests that to be a Jew is to be engaged in praxis, in a web of Jewish activities. And the reason one does that is that if all you have is the letter on a page, that can become somehow an idolatrous figure. What we don't do is worship the dead letter. I know this resonates a lot with Christian theology, but rather we activate, we live the letters. That's something to do with how my book gets its title. And I talk towards the end of the introduction about the Masoretes. The Masoretes are a group, we tend to identify them with a group around the city of Tiberias in the north of Israel, but there were others in some other places approximately 1,000 years ago who, they would say, uncover or preserve a much more ancient tradition relating to the particular ways in which the letters are to be pronounced. The Hebrew language, for those of you who've had a chance to study any of it, is a language which is fairly economical. There's not a huge vocabulary in our language. And often the question is not, let's say you have a word written on a page. That is not the end of the story. You have to work out how the word is going to be pronounced. That's true in English as well, but to a much lesser extent. English, following its influence from Greek and other languages, puts vowels into the alphabet and tells you how it ought to be pronounced, right? There are regional differences in how we pronounce things, but ultimately language is trying to give you a clue as to how the word might be articulated. In Hebrew, that isn't the case. And so every time you read unvocalized Hebrew, which is in the newspaper or in the sacred text or anywhere else, you are forced to work out, how am I going to pronounce those words? For me, for a Jew like me, that's an important metaphor, if you like. Our tradition is something that we didn't invent all by ourselves. It came down to us from generations. Each generation adds its own layer. But our job is to work out how we pronounce that tradition, what meaning we imbue in these words. They sit on the page, but in order to live them, to articulate them, to vocalize them, we have to work out what we're going to do with them. And that nobody can do for us. We have to, that's a responsibility of each one of us in every generation. Okay. I'm going to continue again. If anybody feels impelled to jump in, do not be shy. I promise I will not be. I will not bite your hand off if you do so. Let's see how we can get this to move, if we can. Here I talk about different concepts of theology. And I mentioned that which I've already given a little reference to, a certain skittishness in many Jewish circles. You will often hear Jews say, "We don't do theology. Theology is for the non-Jews. We have faith, we have praxis, actions, but we don't have theological reflection." So I talk about that in the book, and I make a distinction in my book. By the way, I'll happily get this PowerPoint to you. So if you're interested in it, you can look at it afterwards. It'll be no problem. I make a distinction between a minimalist and a maximalist reading of Jewish theology. The minimalist reading is it's theology, theologos. It's speaking about, it's discourse about God. But there is a maximalist version according to which anything that's really important, much wider than simply talking about, does God command you to do X or Y? Anything can be, or anything consequential can be brought in under the concept of theology. So that's the distinction I make between the minimalist reading and this maximalist one. I quote here a provocative notion that everything is theological. That's the kind of maximalist version of this, and I try to explore that. I've never found a better definition of theology than Anselm's famous and very brief one, faith seeking understanding. And I talk about that in a Jewish context and say that to some degree, ours is a little different. There's a bigger emphasis on praxis and what we're actually going to do. This is a story that Levin, the great Jewish thinker Emanuel Levinas, recounts in the name of Hannah Arendt. We won't do all of the biography of all these important people. And this is how Levinas writes. The Christians attach great importance to what they call faith, mystery, sacrament. Here is an anecdote on that subject. Hannah Arendt told the following story on the radio in France. When she was a child in her native Königsberg, one day she said to the rabbi who was teaching her religion, "You know, I have lost my faith." And the rabbi responded, "Who's asking you for it?" The response was typical. What matters in this discourse is not faith in inverted commas, but doing, which means moral behavior, of course, but also the performance of ritual. What the rabbi meant was doing good is the act of belief itself. I'm going to skip, that's in Hebrew. I can't help noticing. I'm going to skip this part of it as well, but here I talk about what I consider to be, this is all part of the introduction, the sort of primary theological moment. And the primary theological moment, I argue, it's captured in a few verses in the Hebrew Bible, is when your children or the generation of your children come to you and say, it's there in the book of Deuteronomy, it's there in the book of Joshua, where they come and say, what is it that you're doing? What does this mean? The theological moment, as I understand it, the Jewish theological moment happens when your children or the generation of yours, the next generation challenges you to justify, to explain, to stand behind the choices you have made and the way you live your life. I write there, I'm quoting from myself, Jewish theology has been greatly enriched by responses to questions from insiders and outsiders. The moment described in these biblical passages combines the question, what does this mean to you, with the corollary, what must it mean for me? When your kids, as it were, are saying to you, what does this mean to you? The implied question is, how might we make a life for ourselves out of these raw materials? So I'm not going to spend too much time more on this discussion of theology. We could spend the whole time doing it, but I want to move on and at least give you a sense of what happens in the rest of the book. I go on and talk about alphabets. If you want a timely example of the significant role of the alphabet in Jewish culture, one is coming up soon because we're in the period, soon to be in the period of the days of repentance. And the confession, the communal Jewish confession recited over this period is alphabetical. It's framed in the plural, and it goes according to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. I can show it to you since we're talking about alphabets. Here you have it. We will stand on a number of occasions during this season and recite this confession, which goes from the Aleph of the Hebrew alphabet to the Taf, from the Alpha to the Omega. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. Ashamnu, we have trespassed, we have dealt treacherously, we have robbed, we have spoken slander. Our confession, which is a key moment in the High Holy Day liturgy and theology, is expressed in this alphabetical manner. I bring here a modern Hebrew poem written by a fascinating woman called Sivan Harshefi, where she takes the same confessional, the same mode, one word for each letter of the alphabet, and she makes it into something positive. Ahavnu, bagalnu, gadalnu. We've loved, we have matured, we have grown. This is kind of a response. She's a religious woman, but she's responding to the highly guilt-ridden nature of the original confession, and she wants to provide another alphabet alongside the alphabet of all the things, as we beat our chest and say all the things we've done terribly badly, some attempt to hold up the things we've done well, an alphabet of achievements alongside the alphabet of disappointments, if you like. This is a story which I would love to spend some time telling you, but there isn't time to do so, so I will just paraphrase it for you. It's a story which is very important for me in the writing of my book. It comes in the Babylonian Talmud, and it's a kind of it's a tale about learning. The story is told of children who are learning how to remember the letters of the alphabet, and they come up with a kind of educational mnemonic system, which, as they're learning the letters of the alphabet and their form, they are also learning moral principles. I'll just give you a sense of what happens. This is in Tractate to Shabbat of the Babylonian Talmud. So they teach Aleph Bet, the first two letters. They say it stands for Alaf Binah, learn wisdom. I'll focus on the next couple of letters. Gimel Daled, that's the C and the D, if you like, of our Hebrew alphabet. Gimel Daled, they say, stands for Gemol Dalim, support the weak. And it goes on, the Talmud goes on and says you can even see a reference to this in the letters. If you look, Hebrew didn't always look the way that we read it today, but it has done for quite a long time. And it says if you look at the letter Gimel, it has a leg reaching out to the next letter. That's to show you that if you are engaged in an act of support for your fellow human being, you should run to do it. And then it says, if you look at the letter Dalid, it has its back turned to the Gimel. Why? Because when you are the recipient of support and help, it's embarrassing. And you turn your back because it's not nice to be in need of somebody's support. And then rather brilliantly, it says, but if you look closely at the letter Dalid, you'll see that even though its back is turned to the Gimel, there's a tiny little protrusion sticking out at the top there, which is to teach you that even though it's hard to be the recipient of help, you shouldn't turn yourself so far away from the possibility that nobody can get to you. You should always leave a little bit there that somebody can grab onto. So it goes on throughout the alphabet, teaching you how you might live your life as it's teaching you basic tools of literacy. And I consider this to be a great aim of education in general, certainly of Jewish education, that I want to teach the Aleph Bet, to teach the tools, the building blocks. If you don't know the letters of the alphabet, you can't make all the infinite combinations, but along the way to dwell on these questions of how we ought to be living our lives. What are, after this, so the introduction covers these and many other themes, and then we get to the contents of the book itself. So remember, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and what you see here are this is spread out over 2 pages. For Aleph, the word that I've chosen is aspaklaria, which is a word that Hebrew took in from Greek and from Latin, and it relates to different ways of seeing. The theme of that first chapter is prophecy and pluralism. B, confusingly, the word be is a word in Hebrew meaning within me or upon me. And there I talk about aspects of spirituality and responsibility. Gader, borders and boundaries. Dovev is a word which I explain in the chapter, but there the thing that interests me a great deal is questions of literacy, of education. As a liberal Jew, I'm very concerned about the fact that many people in my camp lack a firm grounding in their tradition, and I try and talk about that. Hogenet is a political chapter. I talk there about what it means, what it might mean for the society I live in to be considered a decent society. Since I want to tell you, I think we're living through fairly indecent times at the moment. V'goralenu relates to one of the great standard issues of Jewish theology, the election of the Jews. What does it mean for the Jews to consider themselves to be a chosen people? And is that a plausible, is that a possible theology in our days? Zaman Nakat, I talk about history and the reason why history matters so much in my understanding of Judaism. Chai V'Kayam is an old-fashioned theological chapter. It's about the existence and insistence of God. Insistence is a term I've taken from John Caputo, whose work I think is very fascinating in all sorts of ways. Here I'm asking the question about, what do I mean when I talk about God? Tvachim is a chapter about the Torah, studying Torah and understanding Torah. Yetzer Lev Adam, which I describe as an X-rated chapter, is most of it involves quoting a very fascinating and dark source from our tradition, which really relates to the question of the human condition and how it is that we seem to be capable of such dark actions and deeds. Kosot Yeshua is a more general chapter in which I try to offer a typology of different ways in which Jews have thought about the most urgent questions on our theological agenda. Then there's a chapter about the assumption of ritual. I ask a very direct question, which is, tomorrow morning when I wake up, will I be placing upon my arm and between my eyes the phylacteries? Phylacteries, here we go. We're in my workroom, so I can show you as we're talking. These are one of the more bizarre aspects of Jewish religious life. An observant Jew is likely on a weekday, this doesn't happen on the Sabbath or on festivals, to take, these are boxes with verses of the Hebrew Bible written in them, and they are bound typically onto the left arm and then put on the head. And I use this as a kind of example, and I ask the question, will I be doing this tomorrow morning? And there are arguments for and against. So it's a kind of discussion of my approach to ritual. That's what that chapter is about. Masoret is the Hebrew word for tradition. So I'm talking there about tradition. If the exclamation mark looks familiar to you, I also include some reference to the opening number of Fiddler on the Roof, which is the great song called Tradition that you may be acquainted with, and how that came to be. Then I have a chapter which really is in conversation with the Borowitz book I read all those years ago, about the things to which I commit myself, to which I am bound. And then it moves on, just to give you the rest of the chapters. There's a chapter about doubt. The Hebrew word for doubt is safek. Doubt I do not consider in my theology to be just an enemy to be overcome, but actually a tool. It's a part of my theological toolbox. There's a very political chapter on Gaza, where I use the term Azazel. Azazel, you may recall, in the book of Leviticus, where there's a description of the goat that is sent off into the wilderness, the goat for Azazel, and I link that for the Hebrew word for Gaza, for Aza, and play around with those ideas. There's a chapter about prayer, a chapter about humor. There I'm very influenced by a book on that theme by Peter Berger, the great sociologist. There's a chapter about community, about Reshit. That chapter is about the theological standing that I give to the state of Israel. It's a very acute theme at the moment. And a couple of more chapters that I won't try to describe what they're about. The last one I will say something about because I think it may be of some interest. I discovered in my research for this book that there is a mystical tradition in our Kabbalistic mystical tradition which argues that there is a 23rd letter of the alphabet that has yet to be revealed. And I found this to be a very fruitful metaphor or theme in which I talk about in my final chapter of the book what comes next. I don't know what the 23rd, it's not like I exclusively reveal what that letter is, although that would be very good for sales, but rather I try to use that theme to discuss where I think all of this, many of the different ideas that I've been trying to grapple with in the book, what I think the emerging Jewish agenda may yet be. I also encourage or invite my readers at the end of the book to not just to sort of judge my alphabet, but to think what their own alphabet might look like. And I could say the same things to all of you. Here, let me show you. These are from the very last words, not quite the last, but from the very last, near the end of my book. I quote the great Jewish theologian and a colleague of mine, Rachel Adler, who is based in the United States. Describing what she called an engendered Judaism, Rachel Adler set out its core characteristics. It must rigorously interrogate the theological languages of the past while illuminating vocabularies of metaphor and devotion through which God and the people Israel can continue to reveal themselves to one another. We will have to make the theological project as complicated as the world from which we launch it. This requires not a method, but an entire repertory of methods for thinking, for reading, for describing, and for imagining how diversely situated and gendered people have lived, do live, and could live Jewish lives. I invite you, the reader of this attempt to illuminate vocabularies of metaphor and devotion, to think of your own lexicon. What concepts, beliefs, concerns, anxieties, and hopes would be included in your alphabet? What would you seek to impart to a coming generation? So what you have here is an attempt by a what could you describe me as? Well, I'm a professor of Jewish theology. It's the thing more than anything else, I teach and I think about and I care about. Not to write a book about the thought of this or that person, but to set out my own kind of theological program, if you like. It's crunchy, not smooth. It doesn't have all the answers for all of life's difficult problems, but it does try in as honest a way as I can manage to grapple with a whole range of really big issues, some of them creedal, some of them to political, moral, social, that in my opinion are on the agenda. I hope, but we'll have to see. It depends on how folks read this. I hope that readers from outside of the Jewish world will find resonances and points of interest here that they can take up and play with. I've seen as we're going along, Elizabeth's written made a very good point with which I can certainly agree, that crunchy theology is risky business. I think we are in such extreme times that we have to be prepared to take some of these risks. In other words, just playing safe and giving ourselves heartwarming homilies of how, everything is rosy in the garden is not going to help. There is a risk. You're absolutely right. As I go on to read what you've written here, Elizabeth, she writes, for those of you who are not looking at the chat, I can tell you, she says, I can't help but think that crunchy theology is risky business. Just as the particles of peanut butter are irregular and imperfect, so there are risks and possible mistakes in challenging the traditional ways of religious behavior or faith practices and beliefs. If we change the status quo, will we alienate other people in our church or synagogue? Will people fall away? And we live in fear of that happening. However, in the end, I think that the crunchy questions and answers are very important to a living religion and will bring both anxious times and great peace and excitement. I agree with every word. All I would say about the fear of people falling away is that actually in religious circles around the world, with the exception of those offering absolute, often fundamentalist theologies, people are moving away from the kind of liberal religious traditions which I am most excited by and connected to, and therefore thinking that we have to hold the line or we're going to lose people. I understand where that concern comes from, but we're going to lose them anyway, unless it seems to me, or rather than just sort of stand by. I think that what I've tried to do in a book like this is let's try to articulate a theology which is not playing safe all the time and is prepared to ask some complicated questions. Whether or not it works, whether anybody reads it, that remains to be seen. Now we really have got to the point in this presentation where I'm very keen to hear thoughts, questions, comments, please don't. I quote you a teaching from rabbinic tradition: "Lo habayshan lamed." Timid people don't learn. So let's talk, and I'm happy to hear your responses or further questions. I've only given you just a very brief taste of what this book tries to achieve, but I'm happy to field any questions or comments you may have.